In 1920, women won the right to vote in the United States of America. This is often referred to as the first wave of feminism, referred to as the suffrage movement. Since then, we've moved through second and third waves, and now we've really stopped using the wave metaphor as it seems to be a little bit reductive of a varied intersectional movement that is important nationally, regionally, and of course, globally around the world. And so in 2020, the momentous occasion happened in the United States politics where a woman was elected to serve as vice president of the United States. This woman is of South Asian descent. She is also of African American descent. So this makes it a very intersectional first here. And an apt opportunity to talk about feminist theory and communication. And so, as we embark in discussing feminist theory in relation to communication theory, we will really come into a varied, nuanced, unique, and intersectional social movement that is vital for every person as a global citizen to understand the history and also to see the effects and the lasting effects of not only feminist progress and movements towards equality and inclusion, but also the patriarchal forms of oppression that make this history important and make this elected position so monumental. And so we might just sit back and ask ourselves, why is this so monumental? And why is this so important? And here, as we look at feminist theory in relation to communication studies, we will know, hopefully, a little bit more about why it is so important. And so, feminist movement and sex-based oppression. Feminist scholars such as Bell Hooks often call sex-based oppression the first form of oppression because when a child is born, this is the first form of oppression that they encounter. They are oftentimes thoroughly segregated according to sex. Recently, we have gender reveal parties that leave out a whole liminal space in between the binary oppositions between male and female as we continue this thorough segregation of the sexes in our society. And so, feminist movement. And really, the feminist movement is just against sex based oppression. And so I might ask everybody in the virtual room right now who considers themselves a feminist. You notice that my hand is up. And so, depending on if your hand was up or not, I might ask a follow up question. How many people out there are for sex based domination? You might notice that my hand is not up. And so your hand really can't be up for both of those, right? And they really can't be down for both of those either, right? Because feminism is really just against male domination. Feminism is just against sex based oppression. And so very few people will say that they are for sex based domination or sex based oppression. But also, not everybody will say that they are a feminist, even though they might equally say they are against sex based oppression. And so we have an issue here with communication, not really an objective problem with definitions. But a problem with how these definitions and these meanings of symbols are communicated. And so we jump right in to identity. Identity is important. Why do we talk about identity? Because people are born and socialized and enculturated into different subject positionalities. And now these different subject positionalities have differing accesses to power structures currently and also historically. And so identity politics come into play. And so if you identify as a woman, if you have been treated as a woman, then your identity as a woman has to contend with the patriarchal power structure. The lineage of a family is often passed down through the male. Right. And so this is a small element of patriarchy. And I only say small because there are so many ways in which patriarchy or a society based on the male experience, or if you want to say male domination, uh, manifests itself in society. And this is just one of them that we might recognize. And so when we all have that moment and we stare into the pond and look back at ourselves and ask, who am I? Is this me? And should I change? We are engaged in an identity. We are engaged in identity politics. And now, when I say politics, I am meaning we are engaged in dealing with relationships of power. And for feminists, this power structure oftentimes becomes this monolithic structure of patriarchy. And so, gender, male and female, is sex. And sexuality is your sexual orientation. Right? But gender is your socialization according to masculine and feminine traits. And so, once again, just like sex and sexuality, we oftentimes break it down into binary oppositions. And what gets left out is that large space in between. And so many people are born identified as male, many people are born and identified as female, and many people are also born and identified as intersex. But those folks in the space in between are often left out symbolically. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is this unnamed territory and what gets lost in between? And so we can see that. We can see folks being socialized according to masculine traits and folks that are socialized according to feminine traits. But of course, we can be male and feminine, and we can be female and masculine, and we can oscillate between the two, so much so that the binaries become non-descriptive and non-distinct, and we're starting to look at many socializations and social constructions as less linear and more on a sliding scale as we drift much more fluidly along these binaries that are often considered outdated, but still have a lasting legacy and impressions within our daily lives. And so let's all recall that differentiation between gender, sex, and sexuality. Simone de Beauvoir. She writes The Second Sex. And she asks very early on, what is a woman? Now, she was the famed partner of Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist. She also worked with Merleau-Ponty and a phenomenologist. And she entered into the male-dominated sphere of public society in general, but also philosophy and existential continental philosophy, and played the male game. And she played it quite well. At the university, one of the leading philosophical universities in Paris at the time, she scores above both of those philosophical luminaries. And so when she plays this male game, she uses sex-based language. And so she refers to humankind as man, and she tends to use him and he, right? Because that is the convention at the time. And so she starts to wonder who she is. And she questions the identity politics of society as a woman. And she notes that women are socially constructed. And now they're not socially constructed based on biological traits that are inherent and also neutral, but they are designed to subordinate women every step of the way. And so she realizes that as an existentialist, she is free. like all existentialists, right? Because continental philosophy at the time is connected to objectivism and positivist paradigms. And so she has this freedom, but she also has this anguish. This anguish comes as an extra form of anguish within existentialist philosophy, because now she doesn't quite know that she is free as other existentialists are free. So first she has to combat her oppression as a woman and her subordination as a woman to be the objectivist, positivist thinker that other folks within her field get to do. And so this is a strong connection to contemporary feminist theory. It also has connections to intersectional politics and Edward Said's notion of Orientalism. And so Orientalism, by Edward Said, notes that there are a slew of vicious binaries that oftentimes depict the Orient versus the other side. Now, it's probably hard for us to think about what that other side is called, but it is the Occident. And so the Occident versus the Orient, the East versus the West. The East is spiritual while the West is scientific. The East is esoteric while the West is rational, right? And we can go through a slew of words and phrases that depict a hierarchy. Eastern philosophy versus Western medicine, for example. And we see, once again, that binary opposition between the dominant and the subordinate, where one can never break through that signification that moors the label to a place that it can never break free of, if we're still using those same terms. And so you might think, if men and women are continued to be called men and women, and we stick to these same signifiers, will we ever have feminist equality? And so that is a difficult question to answer, because of course materially we hope we do. But if you look at the symbolic binaries, it's almost like a math nearly impossible. And so we start to change, and we start to change the way we use our symbols. And then, of course, reality starts to change as well. Or we change reality, and then we start to see a shift in the words that we use. So we'll talk about a few elements of feminist theory. Number one, and this is a move away from waves and towards shared elements. And so the first one is difference. And so we are oftentimes much more alike than we are different. Just look at our shared norms and behavior across cultures. Just look at our shared biological and scientific and the makeup of our DNA. We're oftentimes so very similar, much like this image here. We see two apples, but we tend to see the difference between the red and the green apple. And so we can clearly see that these are more different than they are, more similar than they are different. But difference is its own difference. And we start to emphasize and pay attention to very small differences. And so the woman's experience is still so very important. Though we are living in an era of a much more fluid social constructions and even biological constructions, we return to the shared experiences of people who identify as women or who are perceived as women. And so the shared experiences of women bring women together. And so we can look at the alienation described by Karl Marx of a proletariat identity that produces solidarity. Why does it produce solidarity? Because the woman experience is marked by a certain level of oppression and subordination that the male experience is not. And so within that, we have intersectional issues, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But what we have is the common and lived experiences of women that inherently bring women together and form solidarity based on an unequal access to power or oppression, if you will. And so the hashtag Me Too movement cut through intersectional lines of race, religion, ethnicity, and age, and talked about an issue of sexual and domestic violence, largely pointed towards women, but not entirely. And so the women's experience became very important as women all over the world started to contribute and say, I had a similar experience. And it was because largely I am a woman and because the perpetrator in the incident grew up and was socialized in a patriarchal world where sex based domination is the norm. And so the personal is political. What a great phrase, as women are denied access to the public spheres, uh, not allowed to enter colleges, not allowed and systematically denied entry into the military institutions and professional spheres. The personal became political now because politics was oftentimes regarded as only taking place in very strict spheres of influence concerning power. And so the personal becomes political. And this is drawn from the feminist movement and feminist theory, but it is now apt across societal spectrums. Marriage inequality, male-centered sexuality, reproduction self-determination, domestic violence, and the control over images of sex appeal are all issues that start as personal issues stemming from the female experience that oftentimes got overlooked. Why? Because they did not happen in the public sphere. And this is the encapsulation of this point. The personal is political. And so moving pretty quickly, we come down to the last element here, intersectionality. Education, family status, religion, language, geographical location, history, heritage, gender, ethnicity, immigration status, ability, sexuality, occupation, age, so on and so forth. We can continue to describe our identity politics. And this is one of the ways that feminist theory runs in to other forms of oppression. And one of the reasons why Bell Hooks calls this the first oppression, sex-based oppression. And this is the oppression that you come home to as a little girl, as when you are identified as a little girl before you are even born. And so this is, according to Bell Hooks, how we become socialized to accept other forms of oppression throughout our lives. It also becomes a problem at times as white middle class women in the 1970s take a radical stance to feminism and attempt to bring all females together based on a shared moment of oppression. The rhetoric demonized the family in certain ways because it was the home to such early forms of female oppression. But you can see for people of color and of different religions and status in society, the family was a safe space against other forms of societal forms of oppression, such as ethnicity and immigration status and race and sexuality. And so the family became a safe space for other forms of oppression. And to call out folks based on their sex, to deny the safety of this space, is to deny the impacts of other forms of oppression. And so intersectionality continues to play a very large role in the way feminist politics plays out. And it is also an interesting way that we might discuss feminist theory in general. Once again, this has been Feminist Theory and Communication Studies combined on this historic moment as we see representation in one of the highest offices of the land finally, after many years, open up to be inclusive of both gender and ethnicity and culture. Thank you.